And you have a new background today. It's very creative. It's a polar bear in a snowstorm.
Exactly. It's literally just No, I do have a green screen behind me. I could put it up if you want to, go somewhere.
I figured,
Yeah. We all want to go somewhere.
Yeah.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. We're very excited to have you join us. I'm just going to start off with a few abridged notes for today. This session is the second in our series of 5 sessions. The sessions are being recorded and will be available afterwards on Facebook, and we will also share the links to the recordings and any links to any materials that we reference via email to anyone who registered for the Zoom. So many of you should have received those emails from me already. If you would like a copy of the materials but you're not registered, you can also feel free to email me directly at rpicker@jcrcstl.org. This discussion will explore the complex features of Jewish peoplehood and the contemporary challenges to Jewish unity. It will not be a political discussion about Israel, but a dialogue about what it means to be a member of the Jewish people, some of our core values that animate Jewish peoplehood, and the ways that our relationship to Israel is bolstered or hindered by those values. We are aware that you are here, even if we cannot see you, and we welcome you to participate as well via the Q&A feature or in the chat. We will be peering at the chat and at questions throughout the sessions, and we will try to incorporate your questions and comments as much as possible. If you are watching this on Facebook and you want to submit a question or a comment, you're welcome to join us on Zoom or to email your questions or comments to autumn@centralreform.org. Autumn also can help with any technological issues or send the link to register if you want to join via the Zoom. We will not be monitoring the Facebook comments during the sessions. We're grateful to our institutions that have supported us and allowed us to come together in this space. Congregation Sheremeth, Central Reform Congregation, the Jewish Community Relations Council of St. Louis, and Congregation B'nai Emunah. We're also grateful to the Jewish Federation's Shema Listen series for co-sponsoring this program. And most of all, we're grateful to the Shalom Hartman Institute, where we each have had the privilege to be fellows, to have space to dive deeply into this learning that grounds these discussions, to challenge, to ask questions, and to explore a model of how to love a Jewish people as an underpinning of even the most challenging debate. And with all of that, I am going to pass this to Rabbi Daniel Bogard to get us started today.
Thank you, Maharat Rori Picker Neiss. I think we're calling each other by first names. Is that what we're, so thank you, Rory.
I skipped that part of the intro. You told me to abridge.
I know, you have to be quick, yeah.
You just have to call her Maharat, that's all. Her first name, Maharat.
That works. So it's a treat to be with everyone today. We're going to talk Jewish identity, as Rory mentioned a moment ago. What defines who we are? What divides us? And most particularly today, what I'd like us to talk about are what are the significant boundaries, not on the edges of Jewish community, but within Jewish community. What are the significant boundary lines that exist, in particular within the American Jewish community? And I'm actually going to encourage us to stay even more local than that as much as we can and talk about the St. Louis Jewish community right here. What are the boundaries, to say it differently, that separate us into different types of American Jews? I'm on an advisory committee for cultural leadership, which I know the three of you know, but for those who aren't familiar with it, it's a group that brings together Jews of all ethnic and racial backgrounds and African Americans of all religious backgrounds to learn about both of these sort of shared histories and stories and backgrounds and so on and so forth. When I joined this committee, one of the things that pre-existed was the way that they explained Jews, and in particular the way that they explained American Jews to the non-Jews in the room, is that they would put together a panel of a Reform Jew, a conservative Jew, and an Orthodox Jew. And so we're getting rid of that. And we're getting rid of it because I don't think that's even a little bit a representative look at who American Jews today are, which is to say, I don't believe that denominational lines or even religious lines or the categories that go along with them are the significant dividing lines when it comes to the types of Jews and expressions of Jewish identity that exist here in the United States. So before we go further, I've got a poem we're going to study. I got a hierarchy, not a hierarchy, a typology of American Jews that we're going to delve into. I just want to go around and let each of you say a little hello and maybe respond to this bigger idea here. Jim, you're unmuted. You want to go first?
Sure. I'm happy to say hi. I'm Rabbi Jim Bennett. And from Congregation Sharamith, happy to be here with all of you and happy to be back together in this gathering for our second week this time around. And I'll just add my early happy Purim wishes to everybody as Purim begins this evening. And we are all looking forward, I think, to a well-deserved festival, holiday time of joy and celebration in a world that has been often devoid of reasons to celebrate. And I think, what comes to my mind right now is actually that very concept that we're so bifurcated, and our lives and our communities and our, not only as Jews, but as human beings, have been under such stress this year that we often find ourselves feeling divided and find reasons for smiling and celebrating and finding joy to be difficult, almost impossible, and actually for good reason. But I'm honored to be able to be here today. I think the coincidence of having this conversation on Erev Purim is particularly important because Purim is such a stark reminder of the heaviness of the world and of life, and division in our lives, and hatred and animosity, and the ultimate hopeful celebration and victory of joy over that evil. So that's my first thoughts, not directly related to your question, but I'll stop there for now and pass the mic to somebody else.
Oh, Daniel got muted.
I was just going to say, Carnie or Rory, do either of you want to take a go at this sort of idea of, do you also agree that the denominational lines are not the significant dividing lines that we see in American Jewish community?
So I'm Carnie Rose. I'm the rabbi of Congregation B'nai Emunah. I'm Rabbi Bennett's next door neighbor, not only on this Zoom, but also in real life, which is great. I want to add that two things. First of all, I thank you for refocusing us on the question, because I would go with Rabbi Bennett and talk about La Yudim Hayta Ora v'Simcha v'Sason v'Ikar, this whole notion of joy and light and happiness, which we would all love to be able to engage in. And I hear, Rabbi, I mean, 100% what you said is so important and so true. And I think we've earned a little bit of frivolity and joy after this very, very complex time, which we still find ourselves in the middle of. So I'll say two things. First of all, before we get to the question, that I'm really a big fan of Esther and the whole notion of that which is hidden. And I'm hoping to find a little bit of the light and the joy that's hidden even in the midst of this crazy pandemic and the difficulty and the darkness that we've all experienced, which of course, makes its way into the Havdalah ceremony, which in and of itself is a bittersweet moment because we're ending Shabbat and heading back into the work week. So even in the midst of the bitterness and the difficulty of the pandemic, we're finding light and joy. But to your point, Rabbi Bogard, Daniel, I just want to say that I think you're right, but I want to add just the word exclusively. In other words, I still think that those categories remain operative for some members of our Jewish community, for a large swath of our Jewish community, maybe not as large as it used to be, but I think for many within our midst, these remain categories that are operative, useful, instructive, but I would absolutely agree with you that they should not be the exclusive categories that we use. And I think it's important that you're on the Committee for Cultural Leadership to bring that to their attention.
So I'm Rory. I'm with the JCRC. If you're going to narrow down all of the institutions, I feel like I sit at an interesting intersection with this question because on the one hand, I think because like so much of my own experience in my work in the Jewish community and in my own journey has been about like finding my place in the Orthodox community and in a community that of which like there are people who want to tell me that I'm not part of the Orthodox community. And for me, finding this space of women's leadership in the Orthodox community included many people saying, well, why don't you just go to JTS, or why don't you just go to HUC? They ordain women. And having to have these conversations about, like, I'm not a conservative Jew and I'm not a Reformed Jew. Like, there are deep theologies within our different movements. And so this isn't just like a, you're bored one day, or this is the closer congregation, or, whatever it is, So on the one hand, like, I feel this need to very firmly hold on to that, even recognizing ways in which, that sometimes feels like something I'm holding precariously, depending on who you're speaking with. But at the same time, I think what you're saying is accurate, Daniel. Like, I think that we are seeing more and more people who are aligning themselves not based off of denomination, but off of other things. And I would say, we've always had people who will talk about, being a cultural Jew, or being a culinary Jew, or, we sort of have all these kind of joking categories. But, I think more than anything, part of what I've been seeing as people are shifting between congregations is oftentimes choosing congregations based off of political alignment, instead of theology or ritual. And I maybe I'm taking this a little further than where you wanted to go with it, but I worry about that deeply, in the sense that I think, when we had this like core theology that was able to bring us together, when we had political differences, we could have that conversation because we were in the same room. But when people are only self-selecting themselves based off of, the views that they want to have, it feels like the religious identity becomes kind of a byproduct of that, but we're still finding ourselves then in these silos where, okay, I might have a different kashrut standard than the next person, but as a community, we've come to accept that diversity. But we're finding that we have less and less opportunities to actually engage with people who are different with us. And I'm sure you're going to name lines that are more than just political, but political being probably the one that I'm seeing most poignantly.
Thank you, all three of you. Really appreciated all the different perspectives there. So I want to push back a little and reject the notion of religious as being the right category for us ever, really. And Rory hinted at this as sort of a new phenomenon, right? That these religious denominations. So I want to share a story. I'm going to put it in the chat for everyone, and we'll also share it. This is from Tales of the Hasidim by Buber. A story of the Rabbi of Kats Rebbe, one of the great sort of maybe doubters of our tradition. I'm going to share it on the screen here so everyone can see it as well. Jim, I believe you and I learned this together for the first time. So is there someone I could put on the spot? Would one of you read this for us? Is this coming through? Are you seeing this on the screen?
Yeah, but
A chassid came to the Rabbi of Kotsk. Rabbi, he complained, I keep brooding and I don't seem to be able to stop. What do you brood about? Asked the rabbi. I keep brooding about whether there really is a judgment and a judge. What does it matter to you? Rabbi, if there is no judgment and no judge, then what does all creation mean? What does that matter to you? Rabbi, if there's no judgment and no judge, then what do the words of the Torah mean? What does that matter to you? Rabbi, what does it matter to me? What does the rabbi think? What else could matter to me? Well, if it matters to you as much as all that, said the Rabbi of Kotsk, then you are a good Jew, after all. And it is quite all right for a good Jew to brood. Nothing can go wrong with him.
Okay, Carnie and Rory, had you all seen this text before? No? Carnie had, Rory.
Of course, Carnie has, yeah.
So reactions, right? Like what is this text saying, like not just on a like surface level, but what is this saying about the nature of Jewish identity as it has been for a long time?
I love this text. I'm so glad you brought it to us today, Daniel. I mean, first of all, superficially, it says it's that the thing that unifies us the most is that we all worry, we all brood about everything. We obsess about everything. It all, and I think that that's in tongue in cheek, but also much that's said in jest is meant in truth. That's my first reaction, not the deepest, I think, thought, but I'll stop there for now.
I'm struck, of course, always that anxiety is the condition, the existential condition of Jews. And that's not a bad thing, really. The truth is that people care, right? There is going to be no tikkun. There's going to be no repair unless there's an anxiety that says we need to repair. And so I've always been struck when I hear this story about that is the reality of who we are. And what unites us, right, in these tribes of Israel, where it is that we're going, is this notion that we care. We care enough to be with one another when we need to be with one another. We care enough to argue with one another when it's appropriate to have dissension. And we also know that when it's all said and done, that we have to love one another enough to come back and set aside those things that divide us in order to love one another and to be together. And there's a power in being together, but the anxiety itself is really the key.
But I think, you know, with that, like the anxiety, that's the caring, right? I mean, that's the engagement. And so, you know, to me, like what that story was is that the questions are far more important than the answers. It's not the answers that define us. It's just, it's staying in the struggle of the questions, because answers are easy, questions are hard. And I think like in what Carnie was saying, it's like in any relationship, you know, being in a fight with someone means you deeply care, right? It's when you walk away completely, when you just, you know, when you're not even interested in saying why what that person did hurt you, or you don't even care that that person's not calling you back, that's when something's been really lost. But when you're hurt, it's because you're deeply invested. And so to me, like that was the brooding, right? You're deeply invested in the process, in the struggle, in the question.
And the unifying nature, I think, of this sense of worry, of anxiety, of brooding, that this is what we share with each other. And you know, the one place I think I disagree with the Rabbi of Kotsk is I don't think that's a uniquely Jewish experience. I mean, I think he implies that that's what it means to be a good Jew. If that's all that it means to be a good Jew to the Rebbe of Kotsk, then we're all Jews, everybody.
You know, I would say that Dr. Arthur Green, Rabbi Arthur Green, would say that this is Hasidism, right, in its initial orientation, speaking to the Jews, but its ultimate goal is to be speaking to the world at large. Exactly. That all human beings have to learn from this Hasidic teaching how to be concerned about the world at large. I just want to add one piece that Rabbi Harold Schulweis, Zichrono Livracha, great rabbi in California, Valley Beshalom, once lamented. It's not about it for conservative Jews or Reform Jews. By the way, this was at a gathering of conservative and Reform rabbinical students, and one Orthodox student who snuck in but didn't want to be, you know, identified to this conversation that he held at his home. And he actually said what concerns him is not denominations. What's concerning him is Jews for nothing. Right? It's the fact that people don't care, and maybe that's the brooding here, right? You have to care about something, care about the world, care about making a contribution. And maybe that's the defining element of what unites us, is that we as Jews uniquely, we're not living up to who we are as Jews if we're not brooding, concerned, have some anxiety. And by the way, somebody put it, you know, there's a difference between anxiety and concern, 100%. So maybe in one group of Jews, this is a concern, but not an anxiety. In another group, this is an anxiety, but not a concern, right? Just different levels of, I mean, we could probably build it up even more.
That was your email's comment, by the way.
Oh, it says cattle rose, C-O-T-O-L, but. Okay.
So I want to raise up that I think there's a piece to this story that is obvious and self-evident to us, but when I teach it in Christian spaces in particular is like mind-blowing, which is the notion that we're not fundamentally creedal, that to be a Jew doesn't mean that you believe in God or believe that God created the world or that the Torah was written by God or any of those things. And so I guess what I want to suggest, and the reason that I brought this poem here to start us with today, is I want to reject the notion of religious categories as being the fundamental dividing lines of Jewish community. And even perhaps reject the notion of religion as being the axis upon we measure Jewishness. That it's separate. Religion is clearly tied and a part of Jewish identity or many Jewish identities. And Judaism is clearly the religion of the Jewish people. But I'm not sure you have to do Judaism. In fact, do we all agree? Is that fair to say that we all agree that you don't have to do Judaism in any way in order to be Jewish? Everyone agrees with that, yeah?
I can live with that.
I could challenge it too, but I could live with it.
Okay.
How about I brood about it for a little while?
Be very, very Jewish of you.
Okay, thank you.
So I want to suggest 5 types, 5 primary expressions that I see of, I'm just going to call it St. Louis Jewish community. And I'm keeping it in St. Louis because there are all sorts of, right, like if you go to Los Angeles, the Persian Jewish community is absolutely a primary Jewish expression. So we're holding it here, but maybe writ large, we can talk about American Jewish community, leaving out Canada, as we talked about last week, is being something a little different. I see 5 primary expressions of Jewish identity in the United States. Or to say it differently, these are the 5 types of people I would invite to be on a panel to speak for cultural leadership if what I wanted was for them to, for the non-Jewish participants there to understand who American Jews really are. Okay, I'm gonna give you my categories. Let me screen share it, or at least paste it in here. I'll just paste it into the chat rather than screen share it. Category 1 though. Oh, there you are. I am calling liberal and engaged. I'm going to explain this, and then I'm hoping that the 3 of you are going to tear this all apart and reject the whole notion of all of it, which feels like it'll happen. Liberal and engaged. And broadly, I think what I'm saying with this category is that all of us are in this category. I mean liberal, and I'd love for any of you to reject that too, but I mean liberal as a mindset towards the world. Liberal as contrasted with fundamentalist. Liberal in the sense that it is a modern outlook on, a scientific approach to the world in acquiring truth, et cetera, et cetera. Liberal and engaged, though, I am using on purpose that engaged word because I actually think that whether that engagement is at CRC or B'nai Emunah or the JCRC or Sheramith, I'm putting them in the same category. I think that it is actually a similar expression of American Jewish identity. The people who are on, Rory, I assume there's some folks on your board who are not members of any shul in St. Louis, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Not suggesting that it's not differences between the folks who, join a shul and don't, obviously, and their level of religiosity or engagement with those things, right? Like 3 of us are helping to run religious institutions, overtly religious Jewish institutions, right? And all of us went to seminary. But that's what I'm calling liberal and engaged, which is to say that I am including the vast majority of Reform Jews, conservative Jews, a whole section of folks who probably go to Beis Abe. I'm including people who engage only through the JCRC, only through Federation, maybe even people who only engage through APAC or through J Street, or If Not Now, or I'm drawing a broad swath there. That's group 1. Group 2, second expression of, Carnie says recon Jews too. Actually, I think one way of understanding this first liberal and engaged category is people who have been influenced by Mordechai Kaplan. That's one way of understanding it, but we don't have to go there. Category 2, I'm calling them fundamentalist and engaged, as in not liberal and engaged, but fundamentalist and engaged. I would say that the vast majority of the Orthodox community probably is in this, at least as I understand it, but I don't think it's a perfect overlap with the Orthodox community. And I'm suggesting that actually the difference between these 2 categories is in many ways a thicker line than the line between conservative and Orthodox, is kind of what I'm trying to say by that. Oh, I guess Carnie didn't like that. He's like, nope, out of here. That's group 2. I think those are the 2 primary expressions of Jewish identity, the 2 primary sub-tribes of American Jews. The third one that's a sub-tribe that I want to suggest are Israeli Americans. I think they are their own thing. I think it's an expression of a unique, it's a unique cultural expression of Jewish identity. And I think we're even seeing examples like Yakir Englander is putting together organizations to work on American Jewish identity. 2 more categories quickly. These are a little different. The first are the self-identified Jewish and the unengaged. I think most of these people are probably our friends and family members. This is my brother, right? People who see themselves as Jewish, but are not a part of the organized Jewish community at all. And so I would suggest that is a different expression of identity. It is a different sort of sub-tribe within American Jewish identity. And the final one that I'm hoping we can really problematize are folks who the broader Jewish community might look at as Jews, but who themselves do not self-identify in any way as Jews. And I think that's a problematic category as well. Okay, that is my, what did I call it? A typology of St. Louis Jews.
Can I clarify? Because I'm just not sure I totally follow. So in the first two categories, when you have the distinction of liberal as opposed to fundamentalist, is that a religious worldview?
I am using that in the sense that we mean, that I actually mean those specific words, liberal and fundamentalist. I mean it in the same way that I might mean I don't mean this judgmentally, but modern and pre-modern view, right? Like if pre-modern as a worldview is a notion that truth arises from a moment of revelation in the past, or a source of truth in the past that we get to us today as a pre-modern source of truth. If modernity is a view that we can acquire truth through the scientific method, and if post-modernity is a recognition that we can only have relative truth, that's really that dividing line right there that I'm suggesting, the line between fundamentalists and liberals.
Yeah, I wonder if you can give like then more of a definition of liberal and fundamentalist to make sure that I'm following. And I have to imagine that if I'm confused, there might be a few people listening who might also. So I wonder if you can just fine tune those definitions to make sure that we're being clear.
Yeah, I mean, the sort of source of truth piece is how I really understand those, like where you understand where truth comes from, right?
Right, so fundamentalist meaning, so truth coming from?
The past, from a received tradition, as opposed to acquired.
So it doesn't have to literally mean the Bible, but the Bible could be an example of where.
Yes, correct. Okay. Fundamentalism tends to mean, like, if you look up the definition of it in Wikipedia, I looked it up right before here. It is a sort of anti-modern perspective, I think is what they call it in Wikipedia, and generally a literalist view on scriptural text, or a divine origin, or however we want to describe that.
That's how I was hearing this as well. Really, the dividing line, as I see it, between liberal and engaged and fundamentalist and engaged, is how you understand truth. Is truth arrived at by free, autonomous experience of the universe, or is truth revealed from God, from a divine source, from some authoritative source? And for all practical purposes, it seems that you are dividing the Jewish community. By the way, not just St. Louis. I know you label this as St. Louis, but I'm not sure St. Louis has any unique truth in this typology, other than adding those who root for the St. Louis Cardinals or Blues, perhaps. But there are Jews who are literalists, and there are Jews who are not literalists. Perhaps that's another version of the same typology.
Yeah, there are certainly literalist fundamentalist Jews in my shul, and in all of our shuls. But I think there's at one point I had this labeled as sociological fundamentalists, because it was really like where you hang your hat kind of is in the fundamentalist community, rather than actually being entirely about a worldview. Because that's my real point here, is that these are expressions of Jewish identity, meaning that we're dealing with sociological categories of Jews. And I'm actually suggesting overtly that halachic theological views are not that, they are not the significant determiner of identity. Yeah. So my question here for you all, well, first, Rory, what do you think, if I can ask you overtly as someone sitting closer to one of these edges, of that as a significant dividing line, as opposed to the denominational line between orthodoxy and
I mean, I have to unpack this a lot more. I'm also sitting with, you kind of started this off saying that you think you'd put all of us in the liberally and engaged, and I'm not sure that I actually, like, as you fine tune the definitions.
I would love for you to reject that.
Yeah, well, I would not wholly put myself into that category. Although, like, I think there's ways that people kind of straddle the lines, right? Like, I would just say, by your definition, like, I do believe very firmly in a revealed truth that comes historically. I also believe that I understand that revealed truth better through the lens of ways in which a modern world has uncovered new ways of thinking that we just didn't have before. So maybe I have a little bit of a foot in both of those, but I do think, though, I agree with your basic premise that I don't think the denominations is a way that we actually, I don't think telling somebody your denominational identity really tells you a lot about a person. And I think the ways in which, look, let me say this a little bit differently. Like I've been thinking about this in the context also of like the interfaith work that we do, in the sense that, we'll often, people will talk about kind of, Jewish Christian or Jewish Muslim or Jewish Christian Muslim or whatever the varieties are. And ultimately what we often see is that it's the liberal, denominations tend to be much more in line with liberal denominations, and the more conservative or maybe fundamentalist denominations tend to have a lot more to talk about with fundamentalist denominations. And even as we might think that those who believe that they have exclusive access to the truth would be less likely to engage, they actually do, because they at least understand what it is for somebody else to say that they have exclusive access to the truth, even if they think that person is wrong for it, right? They don't have exclusive access to the truth, but I respect that you believe that you do. And in ways where, and so I've often thought that the ways in which, there's nothing that's actually kind of that interesting between like very liberal Jews and very liberal Christians finding common ground, because they're actually finding common ground in ways that they've already had a lot more in common, and in ways where we find that within our Jewish community, those who find themselves in these different camps often don't have what to say to each other because they speak a fundamentally different language. And so I'm sitting with your categories as to whether or not those are fully encompassing of all of the categories. But I do think, to me, and I think you touched upon some of it, like this idea that there is a worldview, that there is a way in which we approach the world. There's a way in which I am willing to be convinced of another perspective, or not being willing to be convinced of another perspective, because you are presenting to me an argument in a language that I don't speak, right? So if I do believe in a historical revealed truth, me and you believe in a revealed truth that comes through the experience of modernity in the world around us, then me quoting you a biblical verse isn't going to change your mind on anything any more than somebody who then quotes to that person, modern scientific evidence doesn't change the fact that I believe I understand what it is that God said to me. So I'm still sitting with all that, but I do think, I don't know if these are fully comprehensive, but I think that there is a profound element of truth that you're touching upon in terms of trying to identify how is it that we each walk through the world, and in a sense, what language do we speak? Are we able to translate our language to others, and are we able to hear other people's languages?
So I would suggest that the acknowledgement of other possible truths is itself a liberal worldview. That to me is a marker of a liberal worldview. The possibility that other people have also access to truths, and that there are other truths or relative truths.
And I would also add that it is also possibly true that what Rory already said is true. That is, that people who see their truths as their truths and believe them as true believers sometimes can come together in ways that those who are not true believers can't come together. In other words, they can just, and I see this in the interfaith work that I've done and many of us have done. Sometimes we find, I want to use the term bedfellows, sometimes we'll, just comrades, people, again, I see my own parents' experience, right? They were drawn to people of great faith who were true believers in the way in which they walked in the world. And therefore, we could admire them and love them and respect them, not because our truths were the same, but because our passion for a truth was the same. And that we were willing to go to the mat for that truth with anybody and not be relativistic about it, but rather have deep, deep, deep faith in what it is that we're doing. Now, I would jump to the fact that in the final analysis, maybe that's why I jump into the category of liberal here, and I don't mind owning that, by the way, being in that liberal camp, is that I'm willing to say that there probably are, I really believe this, and maybe we'll get there too, is this notion of many truths that exist, and my truth is set aside for me by my tradition, and somebody else's truth is set aside for them by their tradition, right? By their text, by their teaching, by their explorations. And that isn't a bad thing, because what was it, the old joke, how do you know that God is not American? God speaks more than one language. That if the God is the God of the universe, then God has a way in which to communicate with all people in the way in which they need to be communicated with. Go back to Sinai, right? That midrash that says everybody heard, what they needed to hear, or in the way in which they needed to hear it. Well, why should it only be, if the voice comes from Sinai, the commanding voice, why could it not be heard by all people, just integrated in a different way? And now they're going out in the world and doing that work. So even revelation itself as a notion doesn't only belong to us, but it belongs to all.
Jim, any thoughts?
what I've been harboring a lot of thoughts, one of which is questioning or challenging the whole premise that these tribes, these tribal typologies, this way of looking is actually limited, that one can only be in one of these categories. That in fact, it may be the truth, both internally, that members of the Jewish community might actually see themselves as carrying elements of each of these typologies, which may seem contradictory on the surface, but nonetheless, and Rory, for example, illustrated that when she said, I don't know that I fit into this liberal category, but in many respects I do, but I resist that labeling or that categorizing. But also, my second thought related to that is, I'm not convinced that these tribal typology affiliations, whatever we want to call them, are exclusive to us as Jews. And in fact, to pick up on something Carnie was speaking about, I think you've implied this as well, throughout my lifetime, I have often found myself more closely aligned with people who have similar, by this typology, ideologies, who are not Jewish in any way. They can't be labeled as Jews unless, unless we lump them under the Kotzker Rebbe's idea that anybody who worries is a Jew. But I actually have found myself at times finding that I have much more in common with those in my tribe who are not Jewish, but who are, for example, by your typology, who are part of the liberal worldview. The United Church of Christ down the street, or the people that share so many of my values, that I find myself more closely aligned with them ultimately than with some who are part of the Jewish tribal whole, with whom I have almost nothing in common, and a great deal not in common.
I wonder, Daniel, because I feel like, I think the categories that you've offered are, you sort of mentioned they're sort of like sociological, right? Or I think you've classified them in terms of how they manifest or how we see people. But
I think
I
the primary expressions of American Jewish identity. I think these are the 5 primary categories of American Jewish subcategories of American Jews. I can fit everyone I think of into one of these 5.
And that might be, again, I'm gonna have to like sit with it a lot longer to be able to fully decide how I feel about all of them. But I wonder, I think for me, maybe, I wonder if there's a way to have this conversation, or at least that's compelling to me in terms of having this conversation about values, and like what, right? Because I think like the values are then determine how they manifest, or what are the prioritization of values? Because it's not to say that, I think like to Jim's point, there's other people in which I feel like I share nothing. And it's not like we have completely opposing values, but it's that I'm going to prioritize. So my value of, whatever it is. I mean, I think this again, like kind of comes up in a lot of the political discussions that we have. It's, I always find it really interesting, like in the recent, elections and debate, people will say like, this person wants to give you healthcare and this person doesn't want to give you healthcare. And like, it's misleading, because very few people believe nobody should have healthcare, but it's a value of, do I believe the government should pay for your healthcare, or do I believe individuals should pay for their own healthcare? What kind of healthcare, right? Like it's sort of a, how do we prioritize? And so I think that's part of what I'm struggling with, maybe, is because I think the way that these identities manifest are often not always perfectly reflective of the values. And so I think I'm more compelled by what are the values that drive us to then these manifestations.
So I want to hold on to your healthcare piece, because there's an unspoken influence here in my thinking, which is Ezra Klein wrote a book recently, what's it called? Why We Are Polarized, which is essentially a summary of recent social science research on these questions of tribalism. And one of the things that has been made incredibly clear in the research is that our political positions are articulations of our tribal identities and not the other way around. that no matter how much we believe that it's our political positions that lead us to joining, that's why I'm a Democrat because of these values. It's actually our specific policy positions are almost always expressions of tribal identity rather than the reverse. And I am utterly and completely convinced that it is just as true of religious expressions as it is of any of these other expressions. That just because we call it religious all of a sudden, I don't see why it would in any way sociologically operate differently from this, which is to say that I think our religious practices are actually expressions of our categories of Jewish identity. And I'm suggesting
so where do we get the Jewish
primary categories? Yeah.
So where do we get our identity? Where do we get our tribes from?
From how we are raised, from how we grow up, or from what we explicitly choose, right? And of course, that's we started by rejecting the notion of religion as the primary category of Jewish identity. The place we didn't go to, and perhaps should have early, was also to reject the notion of race or ethnicity as primary Jewish identity. Though sometimes Jewish ethnicity is a primary Jewish identity too at times, right? But clearly,
and if you want to tackle any of there were a couple of questions about clarification. For example, can you differentiate between Israeli Americans and Jewish Americans? Where do modern Orthodox fit? Is revelation, believing in a revelation, something that plays into your categories? Maybe you could address those since you raised the categories. Yeah.
So I suggested Israeli Americans as a separate category, as a distinct tribe of American Jewish expression. I can say what I think, but I've talked a lot recently. Do you all agree with this concept that they are a distinct expression?
I really resonated with this one, by the way, as a person who spent an awful lot of time in Israel, who loves Israel. And, you know, I always talk about when I land in Israel, the hair on the back of my neck stands up, right? Being in Israel, it's just the way I feel. I just feel, 10 inches off the ground. But I also have watched this here in America in particularly in the last couple of years, with the formation of a much more identified group of Israelis within St. Louis, since it's local, right? There's a strong sense of identity. And that is the primary identification. By the way, it's not, there's a different group of people for whom, their real religion is Israel. This is a group of people who come from Israel, right? And then have relocated here. And that's a different element within these tribes. And I think they see themselves in many ways deeply connected to the community. And they've added so much to the plethora of the opportunities within the Jewish world, but they also see themselves as separate. And I can understand organizations like IAC and others that are forming to address the fact that these are really people who see themselves as Israeli, but who are now rooted firmly in America. And they're concerned that particularly their next generation, their children and their grandchildren, will not have that same feel and connect, right, that comes naturally by being born in a particular place and being raised with certain kinds of music and culture and art and food, et cetera, and want to capture that and hold on to that because that was their primary identification as Jews. So I think that's very different, just to answer that question, between American Jews, whose context of where their identity comes from is based in America, whereas Israeli, American Jews, their primary initial identification comes from where they were born.
I think tangential to that, I agree with you wholeheartedly, Carnie. Tangential to that, I've been struggling with another element of this typology, which I have experienced. I wonder whether you all are experiencing this as well, where people who otherwise fit into one of the categories that you've proposed to us. For example, most explicitly, the first category, the liberal, occasionally the engaged, but I don't remember what you called it, the next to the last one, the self-identified and unengaged. Those two categories who exclude themselves from those categories and differentiate between themselves and everybody else in that category around Zionism and Israel and identification with Israel. In other words, the most secular, non-religious, the most liberal-minded Jew on everything else, who becomes, pardon my labeling, but far right when it comes to Israel. And I can think of a lot of people who fit that category, and it breaks down, the typology breaks down for me around that question of, I'm in one category all the time, except when it comes to Israel.
It's interesting you were saying that, Jim. I was thinking of the opposite end of the spectrum, which are maybe the exact same thing, which is to say those Jews that I know who the entirety of their Jewish expression is in their opposition to Israel. That is the totality of how they express their Judaism. But it's real expression of their Jewish identity too, right? Like I don't want to say that that's not. Carnie,
and they may go to sacred text to prove that point, just in the way that those who are what we might call the fundamentalists, right, will go to sacred text. And again, maybe that's the piece here for me, and I don't want to, I don't want to steal the thunder here, but for me, the interesting thing about these typologies is that they start this conversation for us, right? They allow us to begin to generate how, on the one hand, yeah, but no. Like I watched Rory as just watching her face. You're probably not the best poker player, Rory, right? Because me neither. But as I was watching this, I was like, like, okay, I get it. And even we had a little bit of a pre-conversation last evening, and maybe started the juices flowing, at least for me, right? And by the way, I really appreciate that, because I think I love this kind of stuff, right? It's a foil against which to check my own gut on these things. But I would really say that what's happening here is we're understanding that, yeah, that's me, and that's a little bit of me, and that's a little bit of me, and that's a little bit of me. And I'm gonna, bibbity bobbity boo, I'm gonna put it together, and I'm gonna create this Jew in this era for this moment, knowing, of course, that 3 months from now, something may be very, very different within me. As an experience, be it traumatic, be it dramatic, whatever it might be, will change me. But guess what? Other people have walked that path before. In fact, from the beginning of time, right? That is the way the human was created. Gan Eden isn't the ultimate goal. It isn't a monolith that we want. We want diversity, and we want the diversity writ large, but we want that diversity within our own community, and that makes it more beautiful. It makes it more accessible to a greater number of individuals. That for me is exciting. And so Rabbi Lipnik Zichrono Livracha, my teacher used to say, I want an aisle like a grocery store for everybody, right? Jews who want Kiddush go to this aisle. Jews who want davening go to this aisle, right? And by the way, maybe on the way to the aisle for Kiddush, you'll stop and have a little bit of davening too, right? There'll be those panoply of possibilities, and also an institution or institutions or organisms that allow us to grow. Meaning at this moment in time, I didn't need a Chaver Kadisha. But you know what? When my parents died, I needed a Chaver Kadisha. Or, I didn't need to be involved in an organization for Gemilut Chesed, but suddenly I was stuck home for months on end, and I needed to see somebody's face. Somebody needed to bring me food and bring me love. So I think if we're that kind of elastic, we can work within a rubric that's existed for a very, very, very long time, since the beginning of time.
So I love that. And I want to, I think my gut reaction to some of those categories, I think, is the fact that I think many of us often feel like we're being pushed into certain categories, and then we want to resent those because none of us are two-dimensional, right? We're all much more complex. But to use these categories not as ways to put everyone into boxes, but to say there are multiple ways in which our Jewish community exists, and all of them are real and legitimate and valid and existing forms of Judaism. And I think that's the part that it is more important than ever before, because part of what I've experienced in each of these different ways that we've defined some of these identities are those who need to fervently hold on to their identity or try to reject other people's identities as not being valid. And I think oftentimes those are the people who don't see their own identity reflected in our institutions. And I'm using institutions broadly. I don't mean just the congregations, but in our federations, in our JCRCs, right? They don't see themselves, or they don't feel like they have a place. And so they need to ascertain a place. And then it becomes this, like, to the story that you started us with, Daniel, right? Like, who's the good Jew? Right. And I find it fascinating because I will often be in those spaces where, and I think I've shared this, like, when we did this the last time around, where like I really struggle with people who want to push me out, like I'm not a good Jew enough because Israel's not the number one issue that I vote on. Right. Because or whatever it is. Right. And even as like I can quote scriptural verses for why healthcare is something that's incredibly important to me, and I could, be incredibly religious in my practice and fervently attend all of, whatever it is, right? But where, like, all of a sudden people want to create these different measures. And I think that's also on us as leaders in the Jewish community, as inheritors of a Jewish community that has put litmus tests that have been false litmus tests. I think we're seeing people push back on those. And so how can we use these categories to the vision that Carnie laid out, right? How do these categories become not limiting, but actually all encompassing, to say, you can be self-identified and completely unengaged, and we count that, and I think we do, right? We do count, but we don't reflect that somehow. How do we reflect the totality? And I think also, to your point too, I think we've had Jewish institutions that have spent huge amounts of time, money, and effort to push out those Jews for whom their only Jewish identity is rejecting the state of Israel, who also, though, are, whether we like them or agree with their politics or whatever it is, are still very much a part of our Jewish community, just as much as, I can have my vision of what I wish the Jewish community all did, but the truth is that I think, to what Carnie said, I actually wouldn't like that, because we would lose out on the beauty and the diversity of all of the voices that we have, and we don't get to pick and choose which are the voices that are more valid than any other voices.
So thank you, Rory. I want to use that as a jumping off point to these last two categories that I raised. The category of people who self-identify as Jewish, but choose not to affiliate in any way with institutional Jewish life. In those folks who do not see themselves as Jewish, even though some in the outside Jewish community look upon them as Jewish. And Rory, one of the things you said is, hopefully one of the things that's being raised with this typology is the idea that all of these are expressions, and valid, legitimate expressions for people to have of their Jewish identity. And yet so many of our Jewish institutions, I don't mean literally our four Jewish institutions, but I mean American Jewish institutions, actually do not treat those folks who choose not to be engaged with our institutions as having made a acceptable or legitimate choice. In fact, we often don't even treat them as people who have made a choice. We treat them as people who have not received the good truth of membership in my community. I want to tell one quick story about my brother that he raised when I was talking to him about this, and then get your reactions, because I mentioned this typology to my brother, who's a behavioral economist. So he thinks in these ways. And I commented offhand that, of course, the unengaged, unaffiliated folk here who still self-identify, which is for sure my brother, they're not a tribe. They're not a sub-tribe, because they don't have any collective identity. And he rejected that. And it so struck me that he rejected that. He said, absolutely, when he's at a dinner party, if everyone in the room are Jews and he meets someone else who proudly has nothing to do with Jewish institutions, they are friends at that dinner party. Back when we could go to dinner party, I guess on a Zoom meeting or something. And what it really struck me is that in my head, I just wasn't being respectful of his choice as a real choice then, right? That's what I was doing. So I wanted to raise that as a thought for all of us, and what that means, particularly for a country where our institutions have been so engaged in the Jewish identity industry. So please, thoughts, reactions.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. And I think you've hit on a really important category of Jewish life, which is people who just are Jewish, and they actively say that's enough, whatever, and fill in the blank for whatever causes them to be Jewish. They were born Jewish, they were raised Jewish, they feel Jewish, they like Jewish food, they like Jewish music, or they don't. But they still just, that's that category, just Jewish. I'm not any label. Don't try and label me. And I actually find great comfort in, as you described your brother. I think many of these people find great comfort in affiliating with other people who resist all the other labels and say, no, I'm not a joiner. I don't belong. I resist, I refuse, I actually reject any label other than I'm just Jewish. That's how I see what you just described.
Daniel, it strikes me that we're only at Purim, but I'm already thinking Pesach. My mom's been thinking about Pesach since Hanukkah, okay, but that's for cleaning purposes. But I'm thinking about the children at the Seder, right? The 4 children. Well, we all know that great teaching, right? The Lubavitcher Rebbe was the one who brought this teaching that there's a 5th child, right? And in some ways, this is reminiscent to me of that 5th child, right? The one who's just like not even there, right? And somehow or another, the notion of rejecting them or not taking that into consideration is a huge mistake on the part of the Jewish community. Now, what Chabad might want to do with that and what we might want to do with that might be 2 different things, but I'm not so sure they're so different. In other words, we want to make space to say, who knows what somebody's life journey is going to be. And we should just make sure, we don't know what our life journeys are going to be. So let's make space for that. And I think that I said this yesterday in our private conversation, they were Bnei Yisrael, all of them, but they were Shiftei Yisrael. They were the tribes of Israel. They were called that, and they lived geographically close to one another, right? And they shared some things in common, but some things in not. Some tribes could pronounce certain letters of the Hebrew alphabet. Other tribes couldn't pronounce them. Right? I mean, can you imagine vernaculars that were different? Like sometimes we can talk and sometimes we can't talk. There are things we can talk about and sometimes not even worth having the conversation because it's a garnished elephant. It's just a waste of time and energy. And I worry about a community that doesn't have enough space for those kinds of people that you're describing in that category. And I think Rabbi Bennett put his finger on it. There's got to be space for them.
Well,
and who knows? Yeah. And I just want to add one for me, at least, the semi-permeable membrane is such that I could really learn. Like there are things that I have blind spots. They might share with me, and it has happened to me, unbelievably changed my entire mission of what I'm trying to achieve.
Well, and we it's at our great danger that we don't do exactly what you just described, to embrace them, to expand the tent, to include all of those people, not to exclude them out, but to include them in. And Michael typed in the question about synagogue membership. Membership, dues, paying, belonging, identifying, those are not the correct categories. We should be welcoming everybody who self-describes and the most problematic category, Daniel, is your last category. The ones who actively say, I refuse to be included. That's the problematic category for me. What do we do with them? But I agree with you, Carnie. We need them. We need everybody. We need to expand our definition of tribal identity, not to limit it.
Right, even if it's just a foil to help us clarify why we want to be in. Right, I think that's such a profound thing for people throughout their lifetime. Like, why do I not want to be a person who's just out there on the periphery floating? Why do I not want to be a electron with connection? I think that's something very important to me, and I've learned that of why I can't live the way that they and why I need the moorings that I need. But not everybody needs the same moorings that I need. Just like we all got to be loved in the way in which we need to be loved. This is true vis-a-vis our sense of connectedness to Jewish tradition. And sometimes we'll rail against it, but that's the way we need to be loved at that moment in time. It's not a mistake that lovemaking looks a lot like fighting, right? And there's something about that I think is really significant and important for us to learn as we're doing the work, the holy work that we're doing.
This was a teaching by our teacher, Yehuda Kurtzer, the president of Shalom Hartman North America, that stuck with me, where he talks about how most of our institutions are built on the 80-20 model, right? Where there's the 20% who are at the core of our institutions, and there's the 80% who maybe belong, but the high holy day folk, or right, however we categorize, and that so many of our institutions are built with the goal of taking the 80% and turning them into 20%ers. And then actually what we should do is recognize that the 80%ers have made a choice, that they're choosing that. And it's condescending when we pretend like, or when we act like 80%ers should become the 20%ers. 80%ers are perfectly happy, evidently, or many of them, right, if they're being served with what they want, in that 80%. And I think that speaks to these 2 categories here. Can we trust that these folks have the right to make these decisions just as we do, that their sense of their own identity should supersede our sense of their identity, that,
And again, I think we're talking about sort of prioritization of identities, right? Because I think especially for the people in the first category of what you described, where, you know, for many of them, their Jewish identity is a part of their identity. It's not something that they deny. It's something that they deeply know. It might come up at parties or things like that, but, you know, that's not, when they're looking for engagement. And I think especially in a world where there's so many different ways in which people are pulling at us, you know, so I'm invited to a happy hour for YPD, and I'm invited to a happy hour for Cardinals fans, and I'm invited to a happy hour for my job, and I'm invited to, you know, whatever it is, right? And so all of these things are just like, it's which of those identities am I prioritizing, or which are those that I want to then, you know, meet others who share those similarities. But I think exactly for many of them, in my experience, you know, are still people who want, you know, they might not ask a rabbi to do their wedding, but they might still have like a Jewish reading at their wedding, or they might still have, you know, like whatever, like there's something, because it is very much a part of their identity. And I think to your point, Daniel, like I think it is a profound shift, and I think it's a struggle because all of us are part of institutions where the goal is to bring people into the institutions. So like, how do you sort of, you know, there's no way, I think, for us, on the one hand, I agree, we need to kind of expand the tent. And there's also no way to not be somewhat condescending to say, there's a seat here when you want it, but we respect that you don't necessarily want it, but I'm still going to hold you a seat. But that's like fundamentally the only thing we can do, I think, as part of those institutions. But I think when we talk about our Judaism, we need to talk about that. We need to talk about the fact that that people are making these choices, and that in each of these choices, I think exactly to your point also, right? It's not like, I think you said it really profoundly earlier, where you said, you know, when we create a hierarchy of the choices, then the attitude is that there are better choices, and you just haven't made the better choice because no one made it easy enough for you, or you just don't know. But if you knew how great that choice is, you would have 100% made that choice. And I say that like, that's how I grew up in the Orthodox community. Like, people were reforming conservative because they just didn't understand that Orthodoxy was better. And if you knew, right, so it wasn't like a different choice. It was just kind of like more ignorant. And as soon as you sort of like, you know, saw the truth, then you would obviously know the beauty and the richness of it. And it was like profound. I don't think it was probably until I was in college that I really like met people who like fervently just had different worldviews to say, this is absolutely a choice. And I can at any point, I know I can go to a synagogue, and I know that I can engage, and I know I can do all these things, but this is the life that I want to build for myself. And so that's on us to change our language. It's not necessarily just to change our structures, because I think our structures are still designed for those who want to come in. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, right? Like, I think we, like, there's a physical building at CRC that people, when it's open, right, can go into, and you know, there's opportunities. And so people having the choice not to come in is a valid choice. And I don't think you can't create an institution for people who don't want to be part of institutions. That defeats the purpose of them not wanting to be part of institutions. But how do we talk about our Jewish community to recognize that our Jewish community is not our institutions, and it's not the people who choose to engage, but that there is, right, to me, there's a fundamental identity. There's a self-identification that happens, which is why that's challenged by, what about the people who don't want the self-identification, right? So on the one hand, we could say anyone who says they're part of the Jewish community, they get to come to Federation events, they get to participate, you know, we're not kind of checking history at the door. What happens when you have people who then say, and I think this was coming up actually with Doug Emhoff's daughter, right? I can't remember, right, where like the Jewish community was like, this is amazing, there's a second gentleman, and he's Jewish, and like, we've arrived, and here are the Jews, and look at his kids. And then his kids were like, we're not Jewish. And we were like, but you are, like, we want to claim you. And like, we had to really rest, and I don't know that we've actually come to a conclusion, but like, and it's funny because it's not even like we want her to come in and like join us for Rosh Hashanah services. We just want to say, like, look, there's another famous Jew. Like, we just want to have an affinity with her, and she doesn't want that. And I don't think we know what to do with that.
Rory, two things I wanted to add. One is, you said about us, we have a seat waiting for you. I want to, and I know you didn't mean it this way, but I just want to add, for me, it's not that there's a seat waiting, that there's a heart that's open, right? It's not the seat that's open, it's the heart that's open, that we live with that kind of consciousness, that kind of reality, that at any moment in time, we are completely open to the possibility of people coming to us and needing the wisdom that maybe we have, or the wisdom that's been shared with us. We've been tutored and taught and forged. And that's one of the wonderful things about this opportunity, right? Because all of us are actually refracting the teachings of Hartman, right, through the prism of our own being. And I bet you, the folks at Hartman who are watching this saying, well, I don't think we ever said that, or I don't know why we let that guy into the program in the first place, right? But that, there's an element of that. I just want to say something else about the notion of what Rory commented on in her growing up in the Orthodox community. I experienced it very much in my own growing up as well. Like, we have a truth, and if you were just wise enough or deep enough or smart enough or sensitive enough, you would hear the truth and you would see the light. I want to say, though, that the older I've gotten, I had to hold on to the notion that we do have something special. Like, I don't want to let it go. I don't want to be that much of a relativist to say that it isn't beautiful. I want to say that there is something, right, existentially powerful, essentially, fundamentally profound about a sense of holiness, of kedusha, of whatever term we want to use, godliness, the ineffable, whatever, the numinous, whatever. There is something about that is so lost in our world today, that secularism has taken over and not allowed people to even play in that playground of the elevation of spirit, and therefore the elevation of humanity. And I want to stand for that without saying what I think Rory was saying before, that we're looking down our nose. And if you just, just one Shabbos and we'll all be free, right? Like that kind of notion, right? I want to say, though, there is something really profound about that. And my experience tells me that when people are really in the darkest places, they're looking for it. They're looking for those sparks, those holy sparks that are found, I think, most often are heavily concentrated within the spiritual traditions that are extant. Now, maybe you're going to play in many different sandboxes to find those sparks, but I think there's something about those sparks exist. And for me, fundamentally, maybe different than others, and I'd love to be challenged on that. If I don't believe that, I'm not so sure I could continue to do this work that I'm doing right now in a congregation. But as Rabbi Lipnik always used to say to me, you work for God, Torah, in Israel, and the synagogue has the pleasure of paying you to do that, right? I would have just added, you work for God, Torah, Israel, and humanity, right, in this postmodern reality, and the communities that we serve have the privilege of compensating us to do that work.
Jim or Rory, any closing thoughts?
I have a lot of thoughts. First of all, thank you, Carnie. That was really beautiful and inspiring. I want to go back in my closing thought, though, to the previous idea you lifted up as well. I'm deeply troubled by the pragmatic implications of Jews who feel that our responsibility is really first for our Jewish community. And this dialogue has been dancing around the edges of the conversation about Israel today, which is one of the things that brought us together for this public shared dialogue. I think that we really have to be honest with ourselves. And whether we're talking about domestic, when Jews say, well, I'll give tzedakah to help a Jew first before I'll give tzedakah to help other people can take care of themselves, or whether we as Jews in the diaspora or wherever we are think, well, first we have to care for the Jewish people. There's great risk here, and I want to just sort of underscore what you said about the obligation of us to think beyond the boundaries of tribe and to think about the ultimate tribe, which is humanity, and that ultimately, because these tribal boundaries, these typologies are so permeable and actually maybe permeable to the point of non-meaningful or non-existent ultimately, that I, for one at least, am drawn more and more as I get older to the concept that, yes, I am working in the Jewish community, and this is my arena where I've been given the privilege of doing this work, but that constantly points me outwards, constantly. Unfailingly points me outwards towards others, and I can't sit idly by when, and we don't have time to get into it, for example, the constant angst that we brood about as Jews, to go back to your opening story, Daniel. Even now, is Israel vaccinating people in the territories or non-Jewish citizens or non-citizens of Israel? All these debates, we can't live in that and survive. We can't live in that angst and survive. It's an unsettling final thought, but that's my final thought.
I'm going to jump off of that thought to say that I agree with you and I disagree with you at the same time, Jim, in the sense that I do agree. I think that we need to recognize our role within the broader world. But I also think the world is a really big place. And I don't think you were saying this. I'm saying this from my perspective, not specifically in contrast to you. I think there is a reason why we sometimes feel pulled to certain groups, right? Like, kind of what I was saying before, right? Like, maybe I want to go to a happy hour for other lawyers, right? JCRC directors have been doing these weekly happy hours. And, it's like other people who understand, the struggle of the work that we do and, some of the challenges that come up and, this ridiculous question from a reporter because of some, incident that just took place that, whatever, right? Like, there's something to be said for who are the people who understand me and where can I not be so careful about my language? Where can I just kind of, something you said, put your hat, right? Like, take your hat off. So there's something I think that's also important. I think the danger in that is where does that pull me away from to prioritize that at the expense of the rest of humanity? I don't think there's anything wrong with the fact that, like, I can't give tomorrow, like for Purim, I'm going to give some mishloach manot, right? Some of the traditional, food that we give out. And it's going to be to the list of people that I know. I'm not going to give it to, everybody in all of St. Louis. There's a practical element to it. And, I just want to also add that I think there's some questions that I've been seeing popping up in the chat and in the Q&A about, I think there's like a fear that people have of like, what are the ways in which some of these categories put risk the other categories? And I don't see a risk in it. Like, I think Carnie said it so beautifully. Like, this is the full breadth of the diversity of our community. And I think we do also see that, I think we worry that if we let people be the unaffiliated but self-identified or the non-identified, that everyone's going to choose that. And that's our own bias, right? That's our own bias to say, like, if I wasn't doing the work, it would be much easier to do that. But I also think, we also see people who grow up in families who are not engaged or who are not Jewish, who still choose the Jewish community. I think to Carnie's point, right? Everyone has to be loved their own way. Everyone is going to engage in their own way. And so we have to see it not, because that also says, wouldn't it be better for my life to be unengaged, but I've chosen to be engaged because it's what I want for my kids? No, people choose it because it's who they are. I'm a person who needs to have a support structure. I'm a person who needs to have a place I go weekly where I can whether talk to God, talk to my friends. We all find our places in our own way. And so I don't think those categories in any way endanger it. I think they enhance it. And I think we're all enhanced for it.
Beautiful. Thank you. I had a closing, but I think that's a better nechemta than my closing. So I'm just going to thank everyone.
Daniel, before you go, there are just two quick things, because I want to quote our Hartman teachers. Daniel Hartman, who, in the name of his father, said something interesting about shalach manos, and it's germane because Rory mentioned mishloach manot. He said you should send mishloach manot to the people you don't get along with on purpose, and send your children. Right, this was actually David Hartman. Send your children to bring the mishloach manot to the people you don't get along with. What does that really mean, right? Like, sort of metaphorically, this notion, because it creates ahava and achva, shalom, or it creates all this sense of bond with people that we aren't close with, or maybe we've fallen out of touch with over the course of time. That's just one piece. Just this last piece is that Micha Goodman, our teacher, reminded us that there are 974 chapters in the entire Tanakh. And he said only the 972,
I think.
972, yeah. And only the first 11 are universal, and then it becomes particularistic until the very end when it becomes universal once again. And maybe you all heard this lecture from Micha, but it's been done, and Danielle did it as well. I just want to say that there's something about what's the end game, right? So I would say that, and I think my mom actually put it in the chat, all the good things come from my mom, that we learn how to cultivate our concern and care for the world at large by learning how to first cultivate that love within our own community, and then use those tools once we've learned to love the world at large, right? So that we can return, right? We start with universal, end with universal, but in the middle, we need to be involved in the particularistic in order to allow us to help bring the world to the place it needs to be. I think there's something really important about that. And I just want to thank you all, because I had like 4 sermons that I can now give based on your teachings. Daniel, this was an amazing session. Thank you for
This
lifting
was,
it up.
you know, if we're quoting Hartman teachers, let me actually throw in, because I've had the privilege of also studying with Rabbi Gordon Tucker as part of my Hartman fellowship. And one of the things that he did about a year ago, I thought it was so profound. He talked about how at the end of every story in Tanakh, or at least in the Torah, when we'd have these stories, there'd be a pause in the story, and then there would be a genealogy before the story would continue. And he made the point of saying that at the end of certain stories, that the significance of the genealogy was to say, like, there's other stories that are going to continue. We're going to continue our story, but don't think there aren't other stories. Right. I think, like, even in that, right, I think part of the danger that we have is that the Bible has become sort of a universalized book as opposed to a particular book. Right. It's not a story of all of humanity. It's supposed to be our story, but other people have stories too. And so, I mean, I think I appreciate your point also of the working to the universal, but also to say there's nothing wrong with sometimes living in the particular. The problem with living in the particular, I had a professor in college who used to say there's nothing wrong with walking outside and feeling the sun shine on you and thinking the sun is shining directly on you. The problem is thinking the sun isn't shining on anyone else. Right. And so there's nothing wrong with having our story. The problem is thinking that nobody else has a story as well.
That's great.
Yeah, and I don't want to rain on your parade or put a rainstorm over your sunshine, but I think far too often, this is a terrible place to end, but far too often people don't get there. That sounds beautiful, what you said, Rory, what you said, Carnie, it sounds beautiful, but I think we have to be honest that far too often people use the particular as justification for getting stuck in the particular. And that's not okay. And that's a topic for another time.
So
yeah.
I am going to go ahead and end us with my nechemta, because we came back around to it anyways, which is just to say that I hope we can hold on to actually the story of Joseph here, because what we're talking about is tribalism, right? Whatever we're defining it and whatever we mean by tribes, we're talking about tribalism, and we all know the dangers of tribalism. We only have to look at our politics or our newspaper or our Jewish community, or think about the Breaking the Silence event, or to write whatever it is, the dangers of tribalism. But the hope, I think, in the Joseph story is that Joseph is a way of telling a story where lots of tribes come together for a bigger project of changing the world. So I think if we can hold on to that, we can defeat the bad pieces of tribalism. But yeah, may we be like Joseph and their siblings. So thank you, everyone.
Amen.
That was
Happy
additive,
Purim,
right?
everyone.
That's great. Chag Sameach.
Sameach.
Chag Sameach. You'll all, those of you who are still here, you'll get a follow-up email from me with more details. But if all goes well, next week I get rid of these other folks, and we bring in Michal Biton, who will have more wisdom than probably what we, she'll turn all of this on its head. So more to come. But thank you all for joining us. Have a wonderful Purim and an early Shabbat Shalom.